Hey guys, today we're going to be starting our unit on the 1950s, really looking at the whole post-war era from 1945 to 1960. And it's a time period that is often remembered as sort of the good old days, a time period of peace and prosperity. And in this video, we're going to look at that and see to what extent it was a time period of prosperity and to what extent it was not. And here are your video goals. Make sure you can answer these questions and define this vocabulary. So the foundation of America's post-war prosperity, its wealth after the war, was a long-term economic boom. The American economy grew very, very quickly in the time period from 1950 to 1960 and kept growing after that. If you look at that graph, you'll see that actually the American economy has been growing almost exponentially ever since the end of World War II. So the Great Depression was kind of our last really major crisis, and ever since then it's kind of been on the way up. The only exception to that was the crisis in 2007, which our economy is just now recovering from. So anyway, in 1945, America is the richest country in the world. We are on top of the world. It's almost unbelievable. In fact, we control, at the end of World War II, almost 50% of the world's total industrial capacity. That is, America makes more stuff in 1 year than all the rest of the world combined. Now that the war is over, what happens is America shifts its wartime production. All the massive factories that were being used to make tanks and airplanes are now shifted and are being used to make consumer goods, stuff like cars or refrigerators, stuff like that. So there's a ton of money and a ton of productivity that's now, instead of pouring into a war, is going to pour into America itself. And this is going to generate a huge post-war boom that is going to make a lot of people much wealthier than they were before. So some of the major shifts that happened during the 1950s that we're going to be looking at are the emergence of widespread prosperity, which is a big shift from before the war when we were going through the Great Depression. We're also going to see the rise of suburbia. We're going to learn about the baby boom and family life during the 1950s, and we're also going to look at the emergence of a new sort of way of life, potentially even a sort of like new modern American ideology, consumerism. Also, just as a side note, you see in that picture there, a family sitting around watching TV. The 1950s were the first decade where TV appeared, and it quickly became a very, very powerful force in American society. So first, let's look at prosperity after the war. So as we already said, the American economy enters a boom period, and this economic growth is actually shared by a large percentage of the American public. It doesn't just go into the hands of the very, very rich, but actually spreads around, and a lot of people get to enjoy a much more luxurious lifestyle than they ever expected. The root of this, as we've already kind of talked about, is the GI Bill, which allows for all of the millions of soldiers who served for the United States to get cheap college education and government assistance for housing. This allows almost everybody who served in the Army to greatly improve their lifestyle after returning from the war. And I say almost because, very importantly, the GI Bill was mostly for white soldiers and excluded other minority groups. So anyway, that means there's a lot of people now getting good educations, and once they come out of college, they're ready to get good jobs in these new companies that are growing up. So there are really good paying office jobs available to just about anybody who has a college education. And for people who didn't go to college, there are still pretty good factory jobs that pay enough for you to buy a house and raise kids and do the whole American dream thing. Um, and so this is really kind of the first time in America where prosperity was for everybody. If you remember back in earlier time periods, like the Gilded Age, there was a lot of wealth, but it was concentrated in the hands of billionaires. But in the 1950s, this wealth is spread out, and millions of Americans are able to live uh, a luxurious lifestyle. As you can see in that picture there, look at all that stuff that just normal family can have: a boat and a bicycle and a grill and a lawnmower and all that stuff. And this idea of sort of luxurious consumption becomes sort of synonymous with the American dream. Gonna get some stuff. Going along with the rise of prosperity is the rise of suburbia. So actually now today, most Americans live in suburbs. But back in 1945, at the end of World War II, almost nobody lived in suburbs. In fact, suburb wasn't even really a word back then. You either lived, before the war, you either lived in a city or you lived on the countryside as like a farmer or something like that. But after the war, a sort of new lifestyle emerges, and it's set in the suburbs. So in suburbia, what happens is people go out and they buy up very cheap land and they build a bunch of little houses. And you can see there one of the first suburbs ever built, called Levittown, outside of New York City on Long Island. And what happens is they go out and they clear all this land and they build hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of identical or almost identical houses. And the land here is cheap and the houses are cheap, so it actually makes it pretty easy for normal Americans to go out and buy a house, which is something that most people would have never expected. It used to be that only the very wealthy owned their own houses. And so this gives people a lot more space and a lot more house than they ever expected. And how it works is the family lives out there, the kids go to school out there, and the dad usually commutes into a city to work his day job. A lot of women also worked during this time period, but many women were expected to stay home in the suburbs and take care of the children. So this was made a lot easier moving out to the suburbs by the GI Bill, which supported soldiers going out and buying houses. And suburbia was mostly populated by white families. Other racial groups were excluded once again, both because of the GI Bill excluding them and because of discriminatory housing processes. So anyway, this lifestyle comes with a lot of advantages. It's pretty affordable, especially if you have the GI Bill, and it's pretty luxurious. This is way higher living standard than anybody expected. But it also comes with some disadvantages that people didn't really expect. One is that living in a town where all the houses look exactly the same, it can actually has kind of a weird psychological effect. A lot of people feel like they're losing their identity because they live in identical houses to all their neighbors, and like everybody sort of does the same thing day in and day out. Also, this leads to some isolation because the people who move out of the cities and into the suburbs lose contact with their old friends and family and their old cultural traditions that were rooted in a urban community. So anyway, that's suburbia. I know you all know it well, or a lot of you probably know it well. It's become kind of the norm today, but back in the 1950s, it was brand new. So going along with suburbia comes a sort of new ideal type of family. And in the 1950s, a lot of people were all about sort of family values. And the ideal family, as was shown on popular television shows and that everybody like pretended to be, was a family where the man was in charge. The man was supposed to sort of be the leader of the household, and he was also supposed to be the quote-unquote breadwinner. That is, it was his job to make enough money to take care of everybody, to pay for the house and to support his wife and kids and all that stuff. And that was a really dangerous concept, because what that meant is men got paid more because people believed they were going to be supporting a family, and women got paid less because it was believed that their husbands would eventually take care of them. And that's a pretty destructive idea that took a long time and is maybe still not entirely gone from American society. So women were supposed to be, ideally, were supposed to be housewives. Their main job was to be sort of cheerful and competent household caretakers. So they would do the cleaning and the cooking and all of that stuff, all the household chores. And they also were supposed to have kids and take care of the kids and be sort of the mom who's always there ready to take care of them. And that is the sort of stereotypes that a lot of women are forced into during the 1950s. Even if you were a very smart, talented woman, it would be difficult for you to find good paying jobs, and you might end up settling to be a housewife because there aren't really that many other options. One thing that comes out of this is the baby boom. So because the baby boom is right after World War II, all these young men come home and get married, and they all have kids right around the same time. And what this means is there's a whole bunch of children born right in the 1950s. And baby boomers are still around. They're starting to retire right now, and they're actually the largest group in our country. So the baby boomers are kind of the first generation that are still really prominent in our society. Anyway, so the baby boom was partially caused by all these young men coming home and starting families, but it also was caused by a lot of confidence, and because people thought that the future was going to be really good and they were going to make more money and they could support more kids. But also there was a lot of social pressure on women to become mothers. So a lot of people decided to have kids for good reasons or for bad reasons. Going along with a new suburban lifestyle and the general prosperity comes a shift in culture towards consumerism. And consumerism it's hard to define, but it's basically when people start to define themselves and think of themselves primarily in terms of the stuff they buy. Basically, going out and buying stuff becomes central to people's identity during this time period. You are what you wear, you are what you own, according to the consumerist perspective. And this is related to another interesting phenomenon, which is the rise of television. Television first enters into people's homes in the 1950s. By the end of the 1950s, almost everybody watches TV every day, a lot. And TV is really powerful because it can draw people in, and then it can show them commercials. Commercials with actors and images are very, very powerful, and they're a very powerful way of getting people to buy stuff. And as more and more people watch TV, they start to believe that they need to buy these products that are shown on TV in order to sort of live a normal life. TV starts to define for people what is or is not normal. Also, another thing that fuels consumerism is this thing that companies start to do called planned obsolescence. And what this is where companies plan for the stuff they make to go bad or to go out of style within a couple of years. That way people have to buy another one. And this is done by car companies where you kind of have to, where every year they put out a new and fancier model. So if you want to stay fashionable and keep up, then you have to buy a new car every couple of years. And so this is problematic because what this means is that people have to spend more and more money just to appear normal. But it does mean that companies grow and make a lot of money, and these companies go on to employ people. So consumerism, even though it might maybe make some people unhappy, also grows the American economy. So anyway, looking at all of this, were the 1950s really the good old days? A lot of people just assume they were. They're shown that way in movies and stuff like that. And in some ways, they really were a good time. One is that there was widespread prosperity. In terms of normal people living a good life, living with enough money to really, take care of themselves. The 1950s were a good time period. A lot of people more than any before, were able to live and enjoy a sort of luxurious lifestyle. Also, it was a time period of expanding opportunity. Because the economy was growing so steadily, it meant that more and more people could go out and find good and good paying jobs and could look at for new and better opportunities throughout their life. The bad from the 1950s, though, is also important. And it's important not to remember that this wasn't a golden age and that there was a lot of bad stuff going on at the same time. One is that large groups of people were kind of left out. So while white men had a lot of really great opportunities during the 1950s, both women and African Americans were left out of this prosperity almost entirely. Women were either limited to very low paying jobs, service jobs like, being like a waitress or a stewardess on an airline or a secretary in an office. And segregation continues throughout the South and also in northern cities. So African Americans are also cut off from this general prosperity. And this is going to lead to a lot of unrest that's ultimately going to result in the women's rights movement and the civil rights movement that reached their peak in the 1960s. But even for the people, even for, successful white men, the 1950s were not necessarily a great time. A lot of people who really achieved success, who got good jobs and bought big houses, they ended up feeling kind of empty inside. And they started to realize that luxury and consumption didn't really make up for everything that they lost. The boredom of their sort of lame office job, or their house that looks just like everybody else's house, or the conformity of everybody dressing up the same when they go into work. They realize that this doesn't really make up for all the luxury is not worth it. And this is captured in a lot of books and stuff like that. But one book that really captured this that we might look at a little bit in class is a book by a guy named Sloan Wilson called The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. And it's about a guy who, even though he has everything, he's got a good house and he's got a wife that he likes and he's got a good job, something is just not right with his life. And this is him trying to deal with the problems of the 1950s. And so even though the 1950s were a period of prosperity and growth, they were also a time with a lot of troubles that we'll look into more in our next couple of lessons. So anyway, thanks for paying attention, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.